Cosmological arguments are perhaps the most popular type of argument for God's existence, and for good reason. They get to the heart of what the theist is arguing for, that is, a personal first cause of the universe. I think the best formulation of this type of argument was put forward by Andrew Locke in his book, God and Ultimate Origins, a novel cosmological argument. In this video, I will be defending his formulation of the cosmological argument. Premise 1. There exist entities that 1. Are members of a temporal causal series, and 2. Begin to exist. Premise 2. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise 3. If there is an entity that 1. Is a member of a temporal causal series, and 2. Begins to exist, and everything that begins to exist has a cause, then there is some uncaused and beginningless entity, X. Conclusion 1. There is some uncaused and beginningless entity X. Premise 4. If X is uncaused and beginningless, then nothing exists prior to it, and therefore it is a first cause. Conclusion 2. X is a first cause. Premise 5. This first cause is God. Conclusion 3. Therefore God exists. Now, as you would expect, cosmological arguments have to be careful with definitions in order to avoid misunderstandings. So before defending each premise of the prior argument, I wish to provide definitions for key terms that will come up in the video. Time is to be understood relationally as a series of changes ordered by earlier than and later than relations. Change is to be understood here as involving a thing or part of a thing, gaining or losing one or more properties. On A theory of time, this would involve gaining losing properties based on them passing away, while on the B theory of time, the gaining losing is in virtue of having different temporal parts at different times. An event is to be understood as a change or the beginning of existence of something. A cause is to be associated with the idea of something producing or bringing about something else, or efficient causation, in other words. The definition of uncaused is as follows. For any x, if x begins to exist uncaused, then the beginning of existence of x does not have a causally necessary condition. And lastly, x begins to exist means x being finite in the past and not having a static closed circular loop that avoids a first event. With the definitions out of the way, let's move on to defending each premise, starting with premise 1, which states that there exist entities that 1. Are members of temporal causal series, and 2. Begin to exist. Now, I take premise 1 to be rather self-evident. My laptop is clearly an entity that is a member of a temporal causal series, and it begins to exist. No real debate here. Premise 2, everything that begins to exist has a cause, is the causal principle that the argument relies on. The causal principle can be supported by inductive evidence from experience. Everything that we observe beginning to exist has a cause. My laptop began to exist and it has a cause. My shoes began to exist and they have a cause, etc. There isn't a single counterexample to be named. Even quantum events have causally necessary antecedents, so they don't constitute a defeater. So the overwhelming confirmation of the causal principle in experience should be taken as inductive evidence that the causal principle is true. Some might object that a causal principle like everything that begins to exist has a material cause is equally supported by common experience. However, this is false. The universe is expanding, and as such, new space comes into existence all the time. But clearly, new space itself can't have a material cause, since material causes themselves are constrained by existing space. So the modified causal principle fails. So the inductive evidence from experience, in the absence of defeaters at least, should provide sufficient grounds for accepting the causal principle. Moreover, if the causal principle was false, why don't new states of reality come into existence all the time? Why aren't we constantly bumping into other universes that spring into existence from nothing without a cause? Taken together, all the evidence we have supports the causal principle. There isn't any reason to reject it. Premise 3. If there is an entity that 1. Is a member of a temporal causal series and 2. Begins to exist, and everything that begins to exist has a cause, then there is some uncaused and beginningless entity, X. This premise can be defended through the use of an analogy. Imagine a series of train cars in which each train car requires a preceding one to pull it. The train cars will not begin to move, no matter how many of them there are, unless there is an engine, a first puller, which does not require another train car to pull it. If each train car has zero capacity to begin movement without a preceding puller, then having two of them would not yield any such capacity, because 0 plus 0 still equals 0. Having three won't help because 0 plus 0 plus 0 equals 0, etc., etc. Even if there were an actually infinite number of train cars, 0 plus 0 plus 0 add on to infinity still equals 0. Now, consider a series of causes in which each of the causes requires a preceding cause, if it begins to exist, as premise 2 implies. One can similarly argue that the entities would not have begun to exist, no matter how many of them there are, unless there is an entity, a beginningless first cause, which can cause another but itself does not require nor have a cause that brings it into existence. If each entity which has a beginning of existence has zero capacity to begin to exist without a prior cause, then having an actually infinite number of them would also have the capacity of zero. Therefore, there must be a first cause that itself does not have a beginning, since then it would need a cause. So then it must both lack a beginning and a cause. It's important to note here that we should be thinking about infinity as understood in set theory, where infinity times 0 equals 0. Now, one might object to this analogy that the train cars should have already been moving, but postulating that the train cars were already moving is disanalogous to the causal case, since beginning of existence must be analogous to beginning of movement. One might also object that the analogy commits the fallacy of composition. This objection also misses the mark. The analogy does not commit the fallacy of composition, since it is about the nature of the members of the whole. If every member of an entity has zero mass, then the whole also has zero mass. Same with causality. Premise 3 can also be supported through another argument. Consider the following. Premise 1. Every causal chain has a first cause or a transcendent cause, where a causal chain is a strict chain in which all members of Q, except the first member, if it exists, is caused by all prior members of Q, according to some causal law, L. A causal chain is ungrounded if and only if X lacks a first cause, and vice versa. The content of a grounded chain is clearly determined by both its first cause and its causal law. However, the contents of an ungrounded causal chain can't be determined solely by the chain's causal law. A causal law is not an object that causes the existence of other objects, but rather is merely a relation that determines the causal relationship between objects. Therefore, without a first cause, a causal law simply results in an infinite regress of causal conditionals. However, a conditional does not by itself entail its consequent. For example, if it is raining outside, the ground is wet, does not by itself imply the ground is wet. So without a first cause, there is no consequence, and thus no event could have ever occurred. Now, premise 2. Time is a causal chain. Time clearly is a causal chain, since each event causes its subsequent event, and is determined by prior events. Now the conclusion. Time has either a first cause or a transcendent cause. This first cause would again have to lack a cause and a beginning. Next up, premise 4. If X is uncaused and beginningless, then nothing exists prior to it, and therefore it is a first cause. Now, like premise 1, I take premise 4 to be rather self-evident. It simply follows from the definition of a first cause. Now we reach premise 5. Why think the first cause is God? Well, the first cause must have free will and thus be personal, in order to account for how an initial changeless state could cause the first event. If there can't be an actually infinite regress of temporal events, then there must be a first cause which must be either in an initially changeless state, in timeless state, causally antecedent to the first change. Notice this does not imply the first cause can't change, or be in an initially changeless state with an actually infinite past extension on a substantive view of time. In any case, the first cause is initially changeless. The first cause must have the capacity to change in order to cause the first effect that led to the creation of the universe. However, the first cause must also have the capacity to prevent itself from changing initially, for otherwise, the first cause would not have been initially changeless. So then, the first cause must have libertarian free will and thus be a personal agent, since the first cause possesses a certain property that enables the entity to initiate the first change, yet also have the capacity to prevent itself from changing initially. If the first cause was impersonal, it would never have been in an initial state of changelessness, since it couldn't refrain from causing the first event. Now, many launch objections against the first cause being personal. Let's dispel those objections, shall we? Some object that this line of reasoning leads to an infinite regress, since if everything beginning has a cause, then the beginning of the event, which is an agent causing an event, has a cause, and that event has a cause, and that event has a cause, and so on and so forth. This objection fails because, as William Lane Craig 2009 notes, either advocates of agent causation typically say that the agent's causing some effect is not an event requiring a cause, because it itself is not an event, but just a way of describing an agent's causing an event, or they hold that agents causing some effect is an uncaused event. The causal principle is about things, that is, substances endowed with properties, and a case can be made that agent causation fails to meet that definition. In any case, the objection fails. The last common objection to a personal first cause that I will cover in this video is the worry that a timeless being can't cause anything. This objection can be dispelled in one of two ways. First, God could exist in an initially changeless state with an actually infinite past extension on a substantive view of time, as stated earlier. This completely avoids the problem. Another possibility is that God's causation of creation is simultaneous with its effect. Physicists often talk about causes being simultaneous with their effects, so the idea isn't foreign. On this view, God existing alone without the world is timeless, but coexisting with the world is temporal. One could ask how we know God is the cause of the universe and not vice versa, if causation is simultaneous. The answer is that because of God's timelessness, there would have existed a state in the actual world where God exists and the universe does not. So we know God must have been the cause of the universe. So, those are the top two objections to a personal first cause dispelled. In conclusion, the cosmological or first cause argument is a powerful one for the existence of God. All of the premises are plausible, so there isn't any reason to doubt the conclusion that God exists.